The ethereal collective did not believe in privacy. To a civilization of pure, vibrating light, a secret was simply a frequency that hadn't been tuned yet. They had conquered 17 sectors not with warships, but with the Great Infusion, a psychic invasion where they slipped into the minds of a species' brightest thinkers and took what they wanted. They left behind no scars, no ruins, just a planet of hollowed-out puppets who had forgotten how to dream. Ether Lord Vorax, a shimmering mass of violet radiation, hovered in the observation theater of the Void Cutter. Before him sat Desmond Ward. He was a human systems technician, plucked from a deep space relay station. He was disheveled, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, and he was currently humming a jagged, dissonant tune that made the ship's crystalline sensors twitch. The human's neural activity is chaotic. A lesser ethereal chimed, its light pulsing with uncertainty. It is a mess of chemical signals and electrical spikes. It is inconsistent with high-level intelligence. Vorax chittered in a frequency of absolute disdain. It is a biological primitive. Their thoughts are like muddy water. I will simply dive in, filter the defense codes from the sediment, and be done before the solar cycle turns. Prepare the link. Desmond Ward looked up, his gaze steady despite the glowing god monstrosity in front of him. He stopped humming and wiped a smudge of grease onto his trousers. I've told your drones, and I'll tell you, Sparky. My head isn't a database. It's more like a junk drawer that hasn't been cleaned since the Stone Age. You go in there, you're not just looking at the blueprints. You're looking at everything. Vorax didn't bother responding to a meat vessel. It shifted its phase, turning into a blinding needle of pure consciousness. With a sudden, violent surge, the Ether Lord dove into Desmond's forehead, piercing the blood-brain barrier and sinking into the gray matter. In every other species, the infusion felt like walking into a silent, well-lit archive. You found the shelf marked information, and you took it. But the moment Vorax touched Desmond Ward's neural pathways, the archive didn't just disappear. It erupted. Vorax was hit by a tidal wave of biological white noise. It was a crushing, deafening roar of sensory input that the ethereals, in their sterilized perfection, had never evolved to handle. Vorax was suddenly flooded with the vivid, terrifyingly real memory of a dog barking at Desmond when he was 4, immediately followed by the phantom taste of a sour apple, and then a crushing wave of irrational guilt about a lie he told a decade ago. What is this filth? Vorax's consciousness shrieked inside the mental void. Where is the structure? The noise didn't stop. It began to take form, reflecting the millions of years of evolutionary trauma that every human carries in their DNA. Vorax found itself trapped in a hyper-realistic mental reconstruction of a dark, cold cave. In the shadows, things with too many teeth and ancient, hungry eyes began to stir. These weren't data files, they were the intrusive thoughts, the dark, unbidden impulses that humans spend their entire lives learning to ignore. Suddenly, a massive, shadowy version of Desmond appeared in the cave, looking down at the shimmering ethereal with a look of tired pity. I warned you, Vorax. Desmond's conscious voice echoed through the cave, vibrating with the force of a landslide. We didn't evolve in a vacuum of light. We evolved in the mud, running from things that wanted to eat us. My brain isn't a library, it's a survival mechanism. And right now, it thinks you're a virus? Vorax panicked. It tried to retract its energy to flee back to the safety of its crystalline body. Desmond's neural pathways were sticky. The neurons were firing in a jagged, unpredictable pattern that physically anchored the ethereal to the white noise. The things in the shadows of Desmond's mind began to lunge, and Vorax realized with a jolt of pure horror that it wasn't just observing the nightmare. It was becoming the target. Ether Lord Vorax attempted to stabilize its vibration, pushing back against the chaotic sensory overload with the clinical detachment of a high-frequency deity. But the dusty basement of Desmond's childhood had already dissolved, replaced by a sun-drenched, crowded cafeteria from 20 years ago. The air was thick with the smell of lukewarm milk and floor wax. Vorax felt a sudden, sharp spike in its energy, a jagged, pulsing rhythm that threatened to tear its ethereal form apart. What is this sensation? Vorax demanded, its light flickering a sickly, dull yellow. My frequency is being pulled into a subharmonic oscillation. It feels like a contraction of the soul. That's called a panic attack, Vorax, Desmond's voice whispered, manifesting as a distorted version of himself, sitting at a nearby table surrounded by whispering, faceless shadows. Or at least the memory of one. See, humans don't just remember facts. We remember the gut punch that came with them. You wanted my encryption keys. They're buried under a decade of social anxiety and the fear of being perceived as incompetent. Dig in. Vorax tried to lunge toward the data hub it saw shimmering in the distance, a glowing sphere representing Desmond's technical knowledge. But the shadows of the cafeteria children began to point and laugh. Each laugh was a physical blow, a sonic resonance that disrupted Vorax's cohesion. For an ethereal whose entire society was built on unanimous harmony, the human experience of public judgment was a literal toxin. The psychic environment began to bleed a dark, oily substance, the physical manifestation of adrenaline and cortisol. For the first time in its immortal life, the Etherlord felt its pulse. It was erratic, terrified, and loud. "Stop this at once!" Vorax shrieked, its violet radiance being stained by a muddy brown anxiety. "I am a master of the void. I have decoded the secrets of 1,000 suns." "And yet," Desmond replied, his mental projection standing up and walking through the shifting scenery, "you can't even handle the thought of being awkward at a party. You're not in a library, Sparky. You're in a swamp of millions of years of evolutionary baggage. My brain spends 90% of its time trying to make sure I don't die of embarrassment or social isolation. Imagine what that's doing to your pure frequency." Vorax realized with a jolt of terror that it was no longer the observer. It was being infected. The ethereal's ability to communicate with the Void Cutter was being drowned out by a relentless internal monologue. Did I leave the oxygen recycler on? Do my coworkers hate me? What was that noise in the dark? The cafeteria floor began to tilt violently. The sun-drenched room turned cold and damp. The walls shifted back into raw, unhewn stone, dripping with the moisture of a prehistoric cave. The data hub didn't just move away. It morphed into something ancient and terrifying. "We're going deeper," Desmond's voice boomed, now echoing with a primitive, guttural weight that shook Vorax to its core. "Past the shame. Past the awkwardness. We're going back to when the thing in the dark was real and it had a name." From the depths of the primal mind, a sound echoed. A low, rhythmic growling that didn't come from a memory. It came from the ancestral shadow, the part of the human brain that had spent 10 million years listening for the sound of a predator in the tall grass. Outside on the bridge of the Void Cutter, the ethereals watched in horror as Vorax's physical form began to smoke, turning a jagged charcoal black. The Ether Lord wasn't coming out. It was being dragged down. The stone walls of the primal cave didn't just vibrate. They breathed. To Ether Lord Vorax, a being whose entire existence was a symphony of crystalline order, the sudden transition from the modern anxieties of a cafeteria to the raw, predatory darkness of the deep subconscious was like being plunged into liquid lead. His violet light, once a beacon of absolute authority, was now a flickering, dying ember, choked by the thick atmosphere of ancient terror. "This is not a memory," Vorax hissed, its frequency stuttering as it tried to manifest a defensive barrier. "No biological life form lives this long. This data is millions of cycles old." "It's not data, Vorax. It's the source code," Desmond's voice echoed, no longer sounding like a man, but like the rumble of the earth itself. From the deepest shadows of the cave, 2 burning amber eyes ignited. This wasn't a thought of a predator. It was the ancestral shadow, the genetic imprint of the great hunter that had chased Desmond's ancestors across the savannas and into the caves when the world was young. In the sterile perfection of the ethereal realm, there were no predators, only inefficiencies. But in the human mind, the predator was the architect of the soul. The shadow lunged. It wasn't a physical attack. As the beast, a nightmare of fur, claws, and ancient hunger, collided with Vorax, the ethereal experienced something that should have been impossible: biological synchronization. Vorax's energy was being forced to match the frequency of the fight-or-flight reflex. Its pure, vibrating essence was being hammered into a crude chemical rhythm. "My cohesion!" Vorax shrieked, its form beginning to distort into jagged, terrifying shapes. "I am feeling the heartbeat. It is too loud. It is destroying the silence." "That's the survival instinct." Desmond's projection appeared, standing near the cave entrance. He looked different now. Older, his eyes reflecting the firelight of 1,000 generations. "For 10 million years, we survived by being more terrified and more vicious than the things in the dark. You wanted to know how humans think? We think in scars, Vorax. Every time you touch a neural pathway, you're stepping on a trap set by a billion dead ancestors who didn't want to be eaten. Vorax tried to phase shift, to turn into a ghost and slip out of the neural net. But the cave walls suddenly became sticky with a dark, viscous substance, the mental manifestation of adrenaline. The more Vorax struggled, the more the chemical weight of Desmond's lizard brain anchored him. The Ether Lord was no longer a god in a meat vessel. He was a fly in the web of a species that had evolved specifically to catch and kill anything that threatened the nest. Outside, on the bridge of the Void Cutter, the ethereal crew watched in stunned horror. The containment field around Desmond Ward began to glow with a dark, oily purple light. Vorax's physical projection, the shimmering nebula, was being sucked into Desmond's forehead like water down a drain. "The Exarch is being consumed!" A subordinate chimed in a frequency of absolute panic. The human's neural activity is not just resisting, it is predatory. It is hunting the infusion. Inside the cave, the beast began to circle Vorax, who was now huddled in a corner, its light almost extinguished. The creature didn't just want to kill the invader, it wanted to integrate it. The ethereal's knowledge of the stars, its crystalline logic, and its cosmic power were being pulled into the junk drawer of Desmond's mind, being filed away alongside the serial jingles and the third grade embarrassments. "You think you're the first thing to try and take over this territory?" Desmond asked, his voice growing deeper, more resonant. "The darkness tried. The cold tried. The beast tried. We're still here, Vorax. But you? You're a new flavor of nightmare." Suddenly, the cave began to shatter, not into light, but into static. The white noise returned, but it was different now. It wasn't just noise, it was a broadcast. Vorax realized with a final soul-crushing jolt of terror that the link was no longer one way. He wasn't just trapped in Desmond's mind. Desmond's mind was using Vorax as a relay station. "What are you doing?" Vorax pleaded, his voice a broken chime. "I'm sharing," Desmond replied with a terrifyingly calm smile. "I'm tired of being the only one who remembers the cave. Let's see how the rest of your collective likes a little bit of human static." Across the Void Cutter, every ethereal suddenly clutched their heads as the serial jingle from Part 1 began to blast through their telepathic network. Multiplied by the raw, predatory power of the ancestral shadow, the Void Cutter was a vessel of sublime order, its corridors pulsing with the unanimous harmony that defined the ethereal race. Every light, every gravity well, and every life support system was linked to the collective telepathic field of the crew. It was a single, beautiful instrument, but as Ether Lord Vorax became anchored to the jagged, white noise of Desmond Ward's mind, the instrument didn't just go out of tune, it began to scream. On the bridge, the lesser ethereals were no longer standing in their meditative formations. They were staggering, their violet-white forms flickering like failing neon signs. The Great Relay, which usually carried the cold, efficient thoughts of the hegemony, was now flooded with a relentless, rhythmic sound that none of them could block out. "Dirt goes away, and the laundry spray makes your whites bright today." The jingle was more than an annoyance. To an ethereal, it was a psychic parasite. Because they were a species of total absorption, they had no mental immune system. They couldn't ignore a thought any more than a human could ignore a physical blow. The catchy, repetitive melody was vibrating through their very essence, disrupting their ability to maintain their physical forms. "Cease the broadcast!" a navigator shrieked, its light dimming as it clutched its head. "My frequency is being overwritten. I cannot not stop thinking about the laundry spray. What is laundry? Why must it be bright?" But the jingle was only the beginning. The ancestral shadow, the prehistoric beast that Vorax had awakened in the deep caves of Desmond's mind, was now using the ethereal network as a hunting ground. Through the link, the ethereals weren't just hearing a song, they were feeling the raw, chemical fight-or-flight adrenaline of a Deathworlder. Suddenly, a high-ranking officer in the weapons bay let out a discordant chime and collapsed into a puddle of inert energy. It had been hit by a memory spike, a vivid, crushing recollection of Desmond's first breakup, combined with the paralyzing fear of a dark basement. To the ethereal, who had only ever known the cold comfort of the collective, the weight of a single human's heartbreak was enough to shatter its neural matrix. Inside the mental cave, Desmond Ward stood over the huddled, flickering form of Vorax. The Ether Lord was no longer a god. It was a shivering pile of violet static. "You see the problem now, don't you?" Desmond's voice boomed. the cave walls now glowing with the blue light of the ship's hijacked sensors. You spent millions of years evolving to be a clean frequency. You got rid of the static. You got rid of the junk. But humans? We are the junk. We're the survivors of a billion bad days and 10 million years of things trying to kill us. We have a spam filter built into our DNA. You don't. Desmond reached out, and for the first time, his mental projection physically touched the ethereal. Where his hand met Vorax's energy, a dark, oily stain of human doubt began to spread. "I'm not even trying to fight you anymore, Vorax," Desmond whispered. "I'm just thinking. And unfortunately for you, I've got a very vivid imagination." On the Void Cutter, the physical structure of the ship began to change. The pristine, crystalline walls were starting to glitch. In the middle of the main corridor, a hyper-realistic rusted water heater from a 20th century apartment materialized out of thin air. A physical manifestation of a mundane human memory that the ship's reality-warping processors were accidentally trying to render. The ship's AI, a being of pure logic, began to broadcast over the intercom. But it wasn't giving tactical updates. It was reciting a grocery list for a supermarket that had been dust for 500 years. "Warning!" The AI's voice chimed, now sounding suspiciously like a tired human mother. "We are low on 2% milk. Please remember to buy bread. Also, did you leave the stove on?" "You probably left the stove on." The ethereal crew began to wail in a frequency that shattered the crystalline displays. They were experiencing intrusive thoughts on a planetary scale. The collective was breaking. The harmony was being replaced by human neurosis. Vorax looked up at Desmond, its light nearly gone. "Please, disconnect. The collective, it will burn. We will all be human." "Not yet," Desmond said, his eyes flashing with the fire of the cave. "We haven't even gotten to the part where I remember the time I watched a 10-hour documentary on the history of vacuum cleaners. That's a real classic." A massive shudder rocked the Void Cutter. A nearby ethereal warship, sensing the mental pandemic spreading through the fleet's telepathic link, began to power up its main cannons. They weren't aiming at a human fleet. They were aiming at their own flagship. The hegemony was preparing to sanitize the infection. The Void Cutter groaned, but not from physical stress. The sound was a psychic shriek, a structural dissonance that made the very air feel like it was composed of sandpaper and jagged needles. On the bridge, the ethereals were no longer the graceful masters of the stars. They were flickering ghosts, their forms collapsing into piles of unorganized violet light as they tried, and failed, to process the sheer, unbridled volume of Desmond Ward's brainworm. Outside the viewport, the sister ship, the Purity of Thought, loomed like a predatory diamond. Its main cannons were glowing with a terrifying, white-hot intensity. To the ethereal high command, the flagship was no longer a vessel. It was a plague ship, a biological hazard that threatened to pollute the entire telepathic collective with the chaotic, unrefined sludge of human neurosis. "Locking target!" The Void Cutter's own tactical AI chimed. But the voice was no longer melodic. It was distorted, sounding like a skipping record. "Targeting the grocery store on 5th Street. Warning, we are out of frozen peas. Engaging existential dread. Vorax!" A subordinate commander wailed, its body vibrating so hard it was beginning to blur. "The Purity is firing. They are going to shatter us to stop the signal. Disconnect the human. Kill the meat." Inside the mental cave, Etherlord Vorax was no longer an intruder. He was a drowning man. The dark, oily liquid of Desmond's subconscious had risen to his chest, and the ancestral shadow, the great prehistoric beast, was now sitting just inches from his face, its hot, simulated breath smelling of wet earth and copper. "You heard them, Desmond," Vorax pleaded, his frequency so weak it was barely a whisper. "They will destroy us both. Your mind, it is a beautiful, terrible tragedy, but it will be dust in 3 microcycles. Let me go, and I can shift the ship's phase. I can save us." Desmond Ward, sitting across from the ethereal in the flickering light of the cave fire, didn't move. He looked at his hands, which were now glowing with the same violet light as Vorax. The infusion had become a two-way street. Desmond wasn't just a host, he was an architect. "You still don't get it, Sparky," Desmond said, his voice resonant with the power of the ship's hijacked core. "You think my brain is a library you can leave? But you've been in here too long. You've seen the laundry jingle. You've felt the anxiety about the stove. You're not an ethereal anymore. You're a part of the junk drawer. And the junk drawer doesn't let things go. It just keeps them until they're useful. Desmond stood up, and as he did, the cave walls didn't just shatter. They expanded. The mental reconstruction of the cave flooded out of Desmond's mind and into the ship's physical reality. The bridge of the Void Cutter began to transform. Rusted iron pipes burst through the crystalline floor. The sterile white light was replaced by the flickering orange glow of a prehistoric campfire. The ethereal crew found themselves standing not on a deck, but on damp, cold stone. The purity of thought fired. A beam of pure, harmonic energy shot across the void, designed to vibrate the Void Cutter into atoms. But as the beam hit the flagship's hull, something impossible happened. The energy didn't shatter the ship. Instead, it hit a wall of pure static. Desmond had projected the white noise of his own mind onto the ship's shields. The harmonic beam, designed for a perfect universe, hit the messy, chaotic reality of human thought and simply confused itself. The energy dispersed into a trillion harmless sparks that smelled like ozone and old television sets. "I'm the admin now," Desmond's voice boomed over the ship's intercom, but it was layered with the guttural roar of the ancestral shadow. "And I've decided we're not doing harmony today. Today, we're doing survival." On the purity of thought, the crew recoiled as their tactical displays suddenly began showing Desmond's childhood vacation photos instead of weapon trajectories. The pandemic had jumped ship, but as Desmond took control, a new, deeper sound began to echo from the heart of the ship. A sound that made even the ancestral shadow stop and listen. It was a rhythmic, mechanical pulsing from the ethereal's core of wisdom. The core wasn't resisting, it was learning. And what it was learning from Desmond's mind was something the galaxy hadn't seen in an eternity. The mathematics of spite. "Desmond," Vorax whispered, looking at the ceiling of the mind cave as it began to glow with a dark, terrifying power. What are you thinking about now?" "I'm thinking about the time my boss told me I was expendable," Desmond said, a dark smile playing on his lips. "And I'm thinking about how much I wanted to show him exactly how much it cost to replace me." The Void Cutter didn't fire back at the sister ship. It did something much worse. It began to unbuild the space between them. The space between the flagship Void Cutter and the executioner ship, purity of thought, ceased to obey the laws of physics. The ethereals watched in sheer horror as the vacuum of the cosmos began to fill with rusted iron beams, cracked concrete slabs, and endless rows of cluttered office desks. This wasn't a mere illusion. Under the influence of Desmond's mathematics of spite and the hijacked energy of the ethereal core, the human's subconscious was literally programming reality. "What are you doing?" Vorax whispered from within the mental cave. His violet light was now a dim flicker beneath layers of dirty human thoughts. "You are unraveling the fabric of existence. You cannot simply materialize chaos." "This isn't chaos, Vorax. This is my to-do list from the last 10 years, Desmond replied. His mental projection was now seated on a throne made of discarded system boards and stained coffee mugs. "You wanted our knowledge? Here is the most important lesson. Humans survive by creating order in hell. Right now, I'm just moving the furniture into your house." On the bridge of the purity of thought, the ethereal commanders tried to activate their primary resonance cannons. But instead of beams of pure energy, the barrels vomited out billions of paper reports. Each sheet contained a meticulous log of every mistake the ethereals had made during their expansion. It wasn't just data, it was a psychic weight that dragged their ethereal bodies down to a floor that wasn't supposed to exist. Desmond closed his eyes, focusing on one specific, agonizing memory. The feeling of absolute hopelessness while being stuck in a cramped elevator. Suddenly, the entire ethereal fleet froze. The ships didn't stop moving through space. They stopped moving through time. They were trapped in a spatial elevator caught between dimensions. From the speakers in their minds, the laundry detergent jingle from Part 1 began to play on an infinite, soul-crushing loop. "Admin access confirmed," the ship's voice announced, now sounding exactly like a tired, cynical Desmond. "Initiating protocol Monday. Time is now frozen. The workday will last for eternity." The ethereals began to dissolve. Their unanimous harmony could not withstand the concepts of boredom and bureaucratic futility. They were built for cosmic grandeur, and Desmond was forcing them to feel like cogs in a broken machine. But in the center of this mental storm, Vorax felt something new. Through the layers of fear and spite, he sensed a tiny, sparking memory. Desmond's first sunny day after a long, brutal winter. You aren't just us, Vorax realized, his light suddenly surging with a golden hue. You are teaching us? I'm trying to survive, Vorax, Desmond said. But in my world, survival means sharing the load. You wanted to be in my head? Now you're going to help me keep these monsters behind the door. Outside, the ethereal ships began to fuse. Crystalline edges merged with cold industrial steel. It was no longer an invasion fleet. It was the galaxy's first psychic fortress, where beings of pure energy became the very walls protecting one man's mind. But from the deep void, the human sanitation fleet was closing in. And they weren't here to negotiate. They were here to wipe the slate clean. The horizon of the sector was no longer empty space. It was a graveyard of impossible geometry. The TSV Sterile Reach, the flagship of the human sanitation fleet, hung in the void like a giant, white-painted clinical scalpel. On its bridge, Commander Holloway, a man whose heart was rumored to be made of pure industrial bleach, stared at the sensor readings with a look of profound disgust. Confirming visual, Holloway's voice was cold, echoing through the clinical bridge. Asset Desmond Ward has been compromised. The ethereal fleet has been converted into a Level 5 hyperspatial biohazard. It looks like a giant floating office complex made of sentient crystal and trauma. Sir, we're receiving a broadcast from the center of the mass, a technician reported, their voice shaking. It's not a distress signal. It's a request for a quarterly performance review. Inside the psychic fortress, Desmond Ward sat at the center of the core, his eyes glowing with the violet light of the ethereals and the jagged white static of Earth. Vorax, now more of a golden shadow than a violet god, stood beside him. They were no longer prisoner and captor. They were a dual-process system. Holloway is going to fire Desmond. Vorax's voice echoed within the link. His mind is like yours, but it has no junk drawer. It is a vacuum of purpose. He does not fear the shadow. He fears the mess. I know, Desmond whispered, his fingers dancing across a holographic keyboard made of pure thought. He thinks he's here to clean up. He doesn't realize that in a world of pure energy, the cleanest thing you can do is delete the source code. The Sterile Reach didn't wait for a conversation. It fired a logic void missile, a weapon designed to strip away all subjective reality, leaving only the cold, hard vacuum of objective truth. It was the ultimate weapon against mental projections. As the missile struck the outer shell of the fortress, a wall made of materialized 20th century filing cabinets, the world shivered. The cabinets began to dissolve into gray dust. The Monday Protocol flickered. For a second, the prehistoric cave returned, cold and terrifying. The disconnect is starting! Vorax shrieked, his form beginning to fragment. If the logic void reaches the core, our shared consciousness will be erased. You will be a vegetable and I will be nothing. Not on my watch, Desmond growled. He didn't fight the logic void with more thoughts. He fought it with human inconsistency. He pulled from the deepest, most nonsensical part of his brain, the part that loved bad puns, the part that forgot where the keys were while holding them, and the part that believed in luck. He fed the logic void a paradox, the I am lying statement. The missile's payload hit the paradox and stalled. The objective truth of the weapon couldn't process a human's ability to be simultaneously right and wrong. The gray dust stopped spreading. The filing cabinets reformed, but this time they were reinforced with the mathematics of spite. Holloway! Desmond's voice boomed across the sector, broadcast through every speaker on the sanitation fleet. You want to clean this up? You'll have to audit every single one of my memories first. And I've got 30 years of unfiled taxes and embarrassing high school poetry waiting for you. On the Sterile Reach, the lights flickered. The crew began to smell wet asphalt and burnt toast. Holloway's perfect, sterile mind was suddenly hit by a memory leak from the fortress. He saw a flash of a third-grade classroom. He felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to check if he'd left his childhood stove on. He's counter-infecting us, Holloway gasped, clutching his console. The biohazard is sentient. Initiate the final sterilization. Burn the entire sector. Vorax now! Desmond yelled. Together they reached into the ship's core. They weren't trying to destroy the humans. They were trying to do something much more human. They were going to quit. The psychic fortress began to vibrate at a frequency that shouldn't exist. It wasn't a phase shift, it was a total disconnect from reality. "If we can't stay in their universe," Desmond told the fading Vorax, "we'll just build our own. One where the coffee is always hot and the jingles actually have a good beat." As the sanitation fleet fired their final sun-bright beams of sterilization, the fortress didn't explode. It folded. It shrank into a single point of light. A pocket dimension, powered by the marriage of ethereal energy and human imagination. The light winked out. Holloway stood on his bridge, staring at an empty sector. No ships, no office desks, no static. Just the cold, clean void. "Scan for survivors," Holloway commanded, his voice trembling. "Nothing, sir," the tech replied. "The hazard is deleted." But as the sterile reach turned to leave, Holloway noticed something on his personal tablet. A single, unread notification. He opened it. It was a bill. A bill was rendered, universal maintenance and imaginative protection. At the bottom, in small, messy handwriting, it said, "Don't worry about the stove, Commander. I turned it off for you." D. Ward. The Terran Federation logs recorded the Great Sterilization as a total success. A clean sector. A closed file. But in the deep, unspoken corners of the galaxy, a new legend began to whisper. The ethereal hegemony never attempted another infusion. Their shimmering fleet stayed clear of human space, haunted by a resonance they couldn't explain. Every time an ethereal closed their eyes to meditate, they didn't find the unanimous harmony. They heard the faint, distant rhythm of a laundry jingle. Desmond Ward and the Ether Lord did not die. In the moment of the Great Disconnect, they achieved what no other species in history ever had: a symbiotic reality. Within their pocket dimension, the psychic fortress became a sanctuary. It was a world built from the best parts of human imagination and the limitless power of ethereal light. Here, the monsters of the ancestral shadow weren't predators anymore. They were the guardians at the gate. The embarrassing memories and the intrusive thoughts were organized into a vast, surreal library where every human scar was turned into a story of resilience. Humanity's place in the stars shifted overnight. We weren't the strongest or the fastest, but we became the psychic shield of the galaxy. Vast sectors of space were marked as no-fly zones, where the mental static was too thick for any telepathic race to survive. The galaxy finally learned the lesson. A human mind isn't a prize to be taken. It is a self-correcting DDoS attack. It is a labyrinth of 10 million years of survival, and if you step inside, you might never find the exit. Decades later, a lone ethereal scout, drifting near the edge of the forbidden sector, picked up a single low-frequency signal. It wasn't a warning, and it wasn't a call for help. It was a song, a soft, melodic version of an old detergent jingle, hummed by a billion voices in perfect, messy harmony. At the end of the song, a voice, a blend of two spirits, one of meat and one of light, spoke directly into the scout's mind. "The workday is over. Go home. And don't worry, I checked the stove for you." The scout turned its ship and fled. Not out of malice, but out of a new, profound respect for the chaos that lives within the heart of a Deathworlder. The galaxy was no longer sterile. It was loud, it was confusing, and for the first time in an eternity, it was beautiful.